Hey guys, it's Courtney and welcome to another Coloring with Courtney video for Trinity Stamps. Today we're going to be using the Rainy Days Together stamp set to do a little bit of no-line Copic coloring. So I'm going to use my Misty here because this is such a large image. I'm going to go ahead and center that onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. And even though I haven't used this stamp in a while, I want to make sure that it is nice and clean before I stamp with my no-line ink. I prefer to use the Fade Out ink by Ink on 3, but there is a ton of them out there. Whatever you feel most comfortable with or whatever you have in your stash. You could even use a light color Distress ink. I am going to go ahead and stamp this twice just so it's easiest for you guys to see on camera, although just stamping it once is perfectly fine for me. I was able to see it fine. So we're going to start off with her skin, and I'm going to start off with my lightest color like I normally do and kind of map out my darkest areas, which will be underneath her little bangs, on the inside of her arms, and on the inside of her little legs, as well as a shadow that would be cast on her legs from her little dress. Then going in with my darkest color, and I'm going to use this very sparingly in just the very, very darkest areas. So I'm basically going over the same areas that we had mapped out with that lightest color. A couple of reasons why we use our lightest color first. Number one, it saturates the paper. So that will get your colors to kind of blend together a little bit easier, being the Copics do blend in with each other through the fibers of the paper. So the more saturated it is, the more they'll blend. Second, if we make a mistake and place a shadow where we don't necessarily want it to be, it's a lot easier to cover up the lightest color versus the darkest color. Also, colors spread. You may not notice it, especially when you're using a bold black outline on an image, but this is alcohol ink. Copics are alcohol ink. So as soon as you touch that tip of the marker to the paper, that color does spread just very, very slightly. And you probably would only notice it with teeny tiny areas, but getting that paper saturated with the lightest color will kind of prevent the next color from doing that, if that makes sense to you guys. So I'm just finishing off with that lightest color and filling in those highlight areas. I will add just a little bit of color to her cheeks with an R20 and then go back in with that E00 to blend her cheeks out a little bit. Next, I took a Copic Safe pen and I chose to use an EK Success journaling pen, and I'm just using the packaging here as my guide to just draw in her eyes and her mouth. Next, we're going to move on to her hair. Oh, actually, first I drew in these little pieces of the umbrella. I don't know exactly what they would be called, but I don't want to lose them when I do my coloring. So I figured while I have my pen out, I'll fill those in as well. So next we'll move on to her hair, and she's got a little headband there, and I knew I wanted this to be pink. So I'm going to just fill that in with the lightest pink that I plan on using, just so that I don't lose it before doing my coloring. Here is the only place that I go in with my darkest color first. And I always do with hair, just because I like to have that texture. So I typically go in with my darkest color and add in those darkest areas. The darkest areas on her hair will be where her hair is parted and kind of where it's behind her a little bit and tucked in behind her headband, and also random areas. If you're not sure where the shadows should be, just pick some random areas. It doesn't really matter. Nobody's going to point that out to you as long as you have some contrast in her hair. For her bangs, I just created a shadow where they would be underneath her headband and on the tips of her bangs that are kind of hanging over her face a little bit. And that was with the E59. So that's my darkest color. Next, I'm going to go in with the E57, and all I'm doing here is just extending those areas out a little bit further. Just using the very tip of my marker, you can see that my marker is almost straight up and down, and that's the easiest way. If you have to get into small areas or you want that very teeny tiny flick, just use the very tip of your marker and hold the marker straight up and down, and that will kind of help you out with getting that flicking motion, because that does take practice. Next, going in with the E55, and I'm going to extend these areas out even further, almost meeting each other, just leaving a very tiny area for my highlight color because I want her hair to be kind of dark. But I'm just, again, using the tip of my marker. You can see that marker is almost straight up and down, just extending those areas out and extending those flicks out a little bit further. And then finally bringing in that E53 to fill in those highlight colors, or those highlight areas rather. Once I had this done, I did realize that I wanted a little bit more of that darkness to her bangs. So I brought in the E57. I didn't go with the E59. This was my darkest mid-tone. And I'm just going to extend those flicks out a little bit further to make her bangs just a little bit darker than they were before. So next, once that was done, we're going to go ahead and move on to her dress. And I'm going to bring out some RV markers. And again, starting off with my lightest color. So for the bottom part of her dress, you can see that it's kind of like a wavy line, the image itself. This will indicate where the dress would be gathered or pleated. So I'm just going to create little triangles where it goes up. So it's a wavy line where the line goes up. That's where your little pleats would be. So I'm just going to create some triangles there. For her pockets, I'm going to add some shading there so that they do stand out once my coloring was done. Next, going in with my darkest color and just going over those triangles. With my darkest color, I use that very sparingly, just making teeny tiny triangles. For the top portion of her dress, I'm going to add a little bit of shading underneath her sleeve and on either side and on the bottom portion of each of those pockets. Next, going in with the RV25, and I'm just going to extend those areas out a little bit further on the top portion of her dress as well as the pockets. And for those little triangles, I'm just going to make these little triangles a little bit wider and a little bit longer. So I'm going to extend those up a little bit. Same thing with the RV23. I'm going to fill in the entire pocket here because, like I said, I want this to kind of be differentiated between them and the rest of the dress. Same thing with those triangles there. And then I'm going to go in with that RV21, which is my lightest color, fill in the rest of the top portion of the dress. And you'll notice on the bottom portion, I have not done any shading with the exception of the pleats. That's just because I like to do that part last when there is pleats. That way I can figure out how much shading I want to add without losing those pleats. So I get everything done and then I'll go back in and add a little bit of shading. In this case, I skipped the darkest color and just started with the darkest mid-tone and just added just a little bit of shading on either side of the bottom portion of her dress, just to give a little bit of dimension, but still being able to keep those pleats that we had created. So I also used the same color combination for her little headband, and I just added a little bit of shading to the bottom portion, I guess, where it would mostly be tucked behind her ears, and just leave the top portion, or the top of her head, being the highlight for that. Next, we'll move on to her little rain boots, and I'm going to be using a yellow combination, but I ended up switching this. But I'm going to, like always, start off with my lightest color and get that paper saturated. Then I'm going to bring in the YR68, which originally was going to be my darkest color. And I'm just going to be adding a tiny bit of that to the inside of the boots. And then extend that with the Y38, Y35, then the Y04, I believe. And I just didn't like it. I needed something in between that Y35 and the Y04 because the Y04 is so bright and vibrant that I ended up bringing in the Y08 as my mid-tone. And from now on, for the umbrella, when I used a yellow combination, I'm going to skip that YR68. It was just a little bit too dark for me, and I'm just going to stick to the 4 color combinations that I used at the end. So for the umbrella, I'm going to color this every other one. So every other section will be yellow and every other section from that will be the pink combination. So for the top pieces, I guess, or top sections, I'm just going to be adding a little bit of shading to the top portion of it, leaving the bottom as the highlight. For the inside of the umbrella, I'm going to add more shading to the top and just a little bit on the bottom. I want to center highlight because it is a rounder object. It's bowed out. So you want to make sure that you preserve a center highlight. But I also want to add a little bit more shading to the inside to show that it is underneath the top portion of the umbrella. I'm really hoping this makes sense to you guys. But once it all comes together, you'll kind of see what I mean. Because we don't have a bold black outline to fall back on and kind of guide us as to where these shadows should be, or even if we put the shadows in the wrong spot, it won't really necessarily matter because you have that bold black outline that will tell you what is what. In this case, we don't have that. So we have to kind of create that ourselves. Sometimes it's helpful to look at pictures. Look at pictures of an umbrella. Google it and see where those shadows and where those highlights will be. Sometimes it will be common sense depending on the object. Other times you may have to just think about it. Sometimes you might have to shine a light on an object to see where your shadows and highlights will be. Nothing wrong with that. It comes with practice. So I'm going to do the same thing with the pink combination as well. And I'm, with the exception of the top pieces, I am going to add just a little bit of shading to like the little corner areas, just because this would be where the umbrella would start to fold back, or start to not fold back, but bend back, I guess. Not using the right terminology, but I'm going to place my shading for the part underneath in the same exact spot as I placed the yellow, adding a little bit more shading underneath. Now here you can see I went out of the lines a little bit. I'm hoping you can see it on camera. Not a big deal. No line coloring is very scary. It's very scary to try, and it's very frustrating to do sometimes. But just keep in mind that it's actually more forgiving than coloring an image that's stamped in black. Because if you go out of the lines, it's no big deal. You can just make that image a little bit larger, or if you went out of the lines with her hair, just make her hair a little bit shaped differently, because nobody's going to see that line. Nobody's going to know that you went out of the lines. So it's actually a little bit more forgiving, and just keep in mind that it looks bad before it looks good. So if you're not getting the results you're looking for, keep going at it, because I promise you once you're done, you'll be happy with the results. Just keep going at it. So I'm just finishing up the pink sections of this umbrella. Again, just making sure that I leave that center highlight. Anytime an object is round, you want to make sure that you have some sort of center highlight, and that will give the appearance that it is round. Going to finish off with my lightest color here, and I'm being careful not to go into the yellow portion because I don't want to, it's going to be difficult to take that red out. So I am being a little bit careful for that, but as far as the lines with the stamp, I'm not too concerned. So once all of that was done, I'm going to take a gray marker just to fill in the handle of the umbrella. I'm not going to do any shading here. It's so teeny tiny and so skinny that I'm not too concerned with it. I'm just going to use the tip of my marker. You can see that marker straight up and down to fill in that little handle, and then use that lightest RV marker to kind of fill in around that handle where I didn't necessarily go all the way when I was coloring the dress. So next we're going to go ahead and move on to the water, and I'm going to bring out some BG markers. And first I'm going to again start off with my lightest color, which is the BG11, and I'm just basically going over these little ripple marks that are in the stamp, and then I'm going to create some of my own. Especially where she's standing, I want there to be a few more ripples where she's standing. If this was stamped in black, I probably wouldn't. But being I'm kind of relying all on me at this point, I wanted to create a little bit more. Next, going in with that BG15 and basically going over those same areas that we had mapped out. And then the BG13 and extending those out even further. And you can either go on the inside or the outside of these little ripple marks. I don't think it matters too much. I tend to go on the outside. It doesn't really matter. Finally, going in with that BG11 again, and I'm going to fill in this entire area of water. And I did have to go over this a few times because I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I have a hard time getting the BG11 and BG13 to blend. A lot of times I will do a tip to tip, but being this was water, I didn't bother to do that. So I did have to go over certain areas a few times to get those colors to kind of mesh together a little bit more. And then afterwards, I'll go in with a white gel pen and add some reflections in the water, and you can't really tell after that. Going to use that same BG11 marker to just fill in these little raindrops that are part of the image. Again, didn't do any shading for these. These are tiny, and I don't want this to be the main focus. I want her to be the main focus. So next, we're going to go in with our white gel pen, like I said, and we're going to add some highlights and some details to her and the umbrella. So I'm going to start off with the reflections of the water, and I'm just going to go over the darkest areas. For something like water, the shadow areas can also be the highlight areas. So they can kind of be used interchangeably. Also added the belt back into her dress there, and then some polka dots onto the umbrella. So I just used it in the pink section because the yellow is so bright and actually a lighter color. The white wouldn't really show up too much. So I just added the polka dots into the pink section just to give a little added interest. So once that was done, I will go ahead and line up 2 of the sentiments from that same stamp set onto my grid mat here to make sure they are lined up. Pop those onto an acrylic block, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp these with VersaFine Onyx black ink. And that is it. I like to keep these nice and simple just to show you guys the coloring itself. I'll be back next month with another Coloring with Courtney video. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Trinity Stamps channel. Have a great day, guys. Bye.